first night in the cabin, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the attic. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. My heart started racing, but I didn't move. I lay there, frozen, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. I knew one thing for sure. I was supposed to be alone. Let me back up. The whole reason I rented this cabin in the woods was to get away from everything. Work, city noise, the constant hum of life. It had all gotten to me. I was burned out. When I saw the listing for a secluded cabin surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, it felt like the perfect escape. The drive there was peaceful, and when I pulled up, the place looked exactly like the pictures. A quaint little cabin tucked away in the woods, a wraparound porch, and this swing that creaked in the wind. It had character, you know. The forest around it was thick, almost too thick. The kind of quiet where you notice just how loud your own breathing is. When I arrived, I was greeted by Mr. Beck, the owner. He was this wiry, no-nonsense kind of guy, probably in his late 50s. His face was tanned and weathered, like he'd spent a lifetime outdoors. He didn't waste time with small talk. After showing me around the place, basic but cozy, he handed me a single sheet of paper. "These are the rules," he said, holding it out to me like it was the deed to the cabin. I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. The list wasn't long, but it was unsettling. Do not open the windows after sunset. Always leave a light on in the hallway overnight. If you hear knocking after midnight, do not answer the door. Do not move the rocking chair in the living room. It must always face the window. At 3:33 a.m., you may hear humming. Do not leave your bed. I stared at him, expecting him to crack a smile, but he just stood there watching me. "You're serious?" I asked. "Dead serious," he replied. "Follow the rules, and you'll be fine." Before I could even think to press him further, he added one more. "And if you see her, don't speak to her." "Who?" I asked, laughing nervously. "You'll know," he said flatly. Then he got in his truck and drove off like he couldn't get away fast enough. At first, I thought it was all part of the cabin's charm. Maybe this was Mr. Beck's way of giving the place a bit of personality. A harmless gimmick for renters to talk about. I mean, sure, it was weird, but who doesn't love a little mystery, right? The first evening was quiet, exactly what I needed. I cooked some dinner, read a book by the fire, and tried not to think about the list. The cabin creaked a lot, but it was old. That's what old places do. As the sun dipped below the trees, though, things started to feel different. The air inside felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath. I caught myself glancing at the windows more than once, checking that they were still locked. I remembered rule number 2 and made sure to leave the hallway light on before I went to bed. I wasn't superstitious or anything, but it was easy enough to do. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were coming from above me in the attic, slow, heavy, deliberate steps like someone was pacing back and forth. I froze. My brain immediately went into overdrive, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe there was an animal up there, a raccoon or something bigger, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. These footsteps were too human. I thought about grabbing my flashlight or calling someone, but my phone didn't have service, and I wasn't about to go snooping around in the attic. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it would stop if I just stayed in bed. The footsteps eventually stopped, and for a moment, there was this heavy silence. I started to relax, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, and then I noticed the clock, 3:32 a.m. I sat up a little straighter in bed, staring at the numbers. My heart was pounding. Rule number 5 flashed through my mind. At 3:33 a.m., you may hear humming. Do not leave your bed. I didn't want to believe it, but at that moment, the air in the cabin changed. The silence wasn't just quiet. It felt charged, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. The clock turned to 3:33, and then I heard it. Soft, melodic humming. not from the attic this time. It was closer. It was coming from the hallway. By the next morning, I had convinced myself the footsteps from the attic were just the cabin settling, or maybe even a dream. I mean, old places make noises, right? I laughed it off, made some coffee, and decided to spend the day getting a better feel for the place. The cabin was small, but there was something oddly charming about it, like stepping back in time. The wooden floorboards were scuffed from decades of use, and the walls were lined with shelves crammed full of old books, most of them faded and dusty. There was a cast-iron stove in the corner of the kitchen, the kind you'd see in black and white movies. It worked well enough, though it took forever to heat up. There were old photos everywhere, framed in chipped wood and hanging slightly crooked. Most were black and white portraits of people I didn't know, stern-looking men in suspenders, women in high-collared dresses. In one photo, a couple stood in front of the cabin, their faces blurred, like the camera had captured them mid-movement. I didn't like that one much, but I couldn't explain why. At first glance, the place seemed peaceful, but the more time I spent there, the more I noticed things that didn't feel quite right. The woods, for example. When I first arrived, I'd been struck by how quiet they were. It wasn't just the absence of city noise. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling leaves, just silence. As I stood on the porch that morning, sipping my coffee, I realized how unnatural it felt. The kind of silence that makes your ears strain, searching for any sound, any sign of life. I walked around the cabin to get a better sense of the area. That's when I found the basement hatch. It was a metal door set into the ground, padlocked tightly with 3 thick locks. The hinges were rusted, and it didn't look like anyone had touched it in years. Mr. Beck hadn't mentioned it when he gave me the tour, and honestly, I didn't want to ask him about it. It gave me the same feeling as the blurred photo, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it made my stomach knot. Then there was the rocking chair. In the daylight, I could see it better. It sat in the living room by the window, exactly as Mr. Beck had instructed. The wood was worn and polished, and the chair swayed ever so slightly, as if it were responding to a draft. But the windows were closed, and the air in the cabin was still. The rules came back to me then. Do not move the rocking chair. It must always face the window. It was such a strange, specific instruction. I thought about ignoring it, maybe even flipping the chair around just to see what would happen. But something about it made my skin crawl, so I let it be. I spent the rest of the day exploring, trying to shake the creeping unease that kept sneaking up on me. The garden behind the cabin was overgrown, full of tangled weeds and wildflowers. In the middle of it was a stone well covered in moss. The stones were damp to the touch, and when I leaned over to peer inside, I thought I heard something faint, like a whisper. I snapped back quickly, telling myself it was just the wind, even though there wasn't any. Inside, I found a trapdoor in the pantry leading to a shallow crawl space. It was empty except for dirt and cobwebs, but there was a faint metallic smell coming from it, like rust, or maybe something worse. I shut the door and decided not to think about it. By late afternoon, I'd gone through most of the cabin and everything felt off. Little things I couldn't explain, shadows that didn't match where the light was coming from, flickers of movement in the woods that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them, and the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the cabin's strange rules were getting in my head. To distract myself, I made dinner and read by the fire. The chair in the living room creaked occasionally, swaying back and forth like it was alive. I forced myself to ignore it, but every time it moved, my skin prickled. As the sun began to set, I made sure to follow the rules. I checked that all the windows were shut, locked the front door, and left the hallway light on. I didn't believe the rules actually meant anything, but they gave me a weird sense of comfort. By the time the woods outside went dark, the cabin's atmosphere had changed completely. The warm, cozy feel it had during the day was gone. Shadows stretched long across the walls, and the stillness of the air wasn't calming anymore. It was suffocating. It felt like the cabin itself was watching me, waiting for something. I climbed into bed early, too uneasy to stay up. The hallway light cast a soft glow under my door, and I tried to tell myself that everything was fine. I'd followed the rules. Nothing was going to happen. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. At first, I thought it was silence that woke me, that overwhelming, unnatural quiet. Then I realized it wasn't quiet at all. It was the rocking chair. Creak, creak, creak. The sound was faint but deliberate, like someone was sitting in it, slowly rocking back and forth. I froze. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. I wanted to get up, to check the chair, but I couldn't move. My brain screamed at me to stay in bed, and for once I listened. Eventually the creaking stopped, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself to go into the living room. The chair was still there, facing the window, swaying gently as if it had never stopped. That night I made my first mistake. I was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. The lingering tension from the previous night's footsteps and that unnerving rocking chair had me on edge all day. By the time I crawled into bed, I just wanted to forget everything, even the rules. The hallway light. I didn't leave it on. It wasn't intentional. I was just so used to turning lights off before bed that it happened automatically. I remember standing in the doorway of my room, glancing back toward the switch, debating whether to turn it back on. But I told myself I'd been overthinking it. Nothing happened the night before when I followed the rules, so why should it matter now? I turned over in bed and drifted off quickly, but that peace didn't last long. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. Knocking. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Like whoever, or whatever, was at the door wanted me to know they were there. Tap, tap, tap. I lay perfectly still, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might shake the bed. My first thought was that it must have been the wind. But then, why was the knocking so rhythmic? Why 3 taps? Then nothing. I stared at the ceiling, hoping the sound would go away on its own, but it didn't. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear anything else. The knocking wasn't frantic or aggressive. It was patient, like it was waiting. I reached for the flashlight on my nightstand and tiptoed toward the front door, my bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The knocking stopped the moment I stepped into the living room. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something to happen. But there was only silence. I stood there for what felt like minutes before whispering, "Who's there?" Nothing. The silence was suffocating, and against every bit of common sense screaming at me to turn around and go back to bed, I crept closer to the door. My hands were shaking as I reached for the lock, pausing for just a second before turning it and cracking the door open. I shined my flashlight out onto the porch. No one was there. The woods stretched out before me, dark and still, the trees casting long, jagged shadows in the moonlight. The air was cold, and my breath came out in short, nervous puffs. I scanned the area, sweeping the flashlight across the dirt path leading up to the cabin, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Bare, muddy footprints leading from the porch steps into the woods. They weren't there when I came inside earlier, and there was no mud near the cabin. The path was dry and cracked from the sun, but these prints were fresh. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away until I bumped into the couch. My breathing was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned the flashlight off and crept back into my bedroom, suddenly hyper-aware of every creak the floor made under my weight. I crawled into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin, staring at the clock on the wall. 3:12 a.m. That's when I remembered. Rule number 3. If you hear knocking past midnight, do not answer the door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every sound, every groan of the cabin's old wood, every gust of wind outside felt like it was coming closer. I kept waiting for the knocking to start again, or worse, for something to come through the door I'd foolishly opened. When the sun finally rose, I felt a wave of relief, though it did nothing to shake the unease sitting in my chest. I got out of bed and cautiously walked to the front door. The footprints were gone. I stared at the dirt path for a long time, trying to make sense of it. There wasn't even a smudge where the muddy prints had been. It was like they'd never existed. That's when my phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin before realizing it was just Mr. Beck. "Morning," he said casually, like we were old friends. "Mr. Beck, someone was here last night," I blurted out. My voice was shaky, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. They knocked on the door and there were footprints, bare footprints. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Did you follow the rules?" "What? The rules?" he said, his tone sharper now. "Did you leave the hallway light on?" I swallowed hard, guilt washing over me. Number I forgot. His sigh was heavy, like he'd been expecting that answer. "Don't forget again," he said firmly. "What happens if I don't follow them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on with this cabin?" Another long pause. Then he said, "The rules aren't just for you. They're for it." "What do you mean, it?" I asked, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. "You'll know," he said, and then the line went dead. I sat there, staring at my phone, replaying his words over and over in my mind. The rules aren't just for you, they're for it. I couldn't focus on anything for the rest of the day. My nerves were shot, and every little sound made me jump. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, like something unseen was sharing the space with me. Even the woods outside seemed darker, the shadows stretching longer than they should. That night I didn't take any chances. I double-checked the windows, locked every door, and left the hallway light on. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to break the rules again. The morning after hearing the dragging footsteps and finding the muddy handprints, I felt like my nerves were raw, like I was unraveling. Every sound, every creak of the cabin made me jump. I told myself I just needed to stick to the rules. As long as I followed them, I'd be okay. But that was the first lie I told myself that day. I spent most of the morning pacing the cabin, trying to make sense of what had happened. The hallway light was still on when I got up, and I double-checked the windows before going to bed. Yet somehow, there were handprints inside the glass and dragging footsteps outside my bedroom. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the list of rules. It felt heavier in my hands, the paper curling slightly at the edges like it had soaked up the tension in the air. I read the rules over and over, memorizing them like they were scripture. But the more I stared, the more I noticed something off. The handwriting. It wasn't the same as when Mr. Beck gave me the paper. The crisp, neat handwriting was now jagged, almost frantic, and then I saw it. Something new scrawled in red ink at the bottom of the page. "Do not try to leave." My chest tightened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the one in control anymore, that whatever was in this cabin had been watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Around noon, as I was trying to busy myself with cleaning, I heard it, humming. It was soft at first, like someone was singing to themselves upstairs in the attic. The sound was melodic, almost hypnotic, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. I froze, gripping the counter as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the woods or the living room. It was coming from the attic. My mind immediately went to the footsteps I'd heard on the first night. Back then, I convinced myself it was nothing, a creaky old cabin settling in the night. But now I wasn't so sure. I stood at the base of the attic hatch, staring up at the pull cord. The humming was still there, steady and unchanging, like a loop stuck on repeat. I reached up, my fingertips brushing the cord, but I couldn't bring myself to pull it. I didn't want to know what was up there. By the afternoon, I noticed another problem: the front window. No matter how many times I latched it, the window wouldn't stay closed. The first time it happened, I thought I had just forgotten to lock it. But then I found it wide open again, the cool breeze carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth. I latched it again, making sure to press it tightly this time, and turned away. But not even 5 minutes later, I felt the chill again. When I turned around, the window was wide open. I locked it a third time, twisting the latch so tightly I thought it might snap. That's when I saw them, handprints on the glass. At first, I thought they were outside. But as I leaned closer, my stomach dropped. They weren't outside. The handprints were inside the glass. By now, the cabin felt different, like the air had thickened, pressing down on me with an invisible weight. I tried to distract myself, pacing from room to room, double-checking locks, keeping busy. But everything I did only seemed to make the tension worse. At some point, I glanced at the list of rules again. That's when I noticed the red ink. It wasn't just the added warning, "Do not try to leave." The ink looked fresh, almost wet, and as I stared at it, the letters seemed to shift slightly, like they were alive. I sat on the couch, clutching the paper, and tried to calm my breathing. The thought of leaving crossed my mind again, but now, with the new rule, it felt like the cabin itself was daring me to try. That night, I followed the rules obsessively. I checked every window 3 times, locked every door, left the hallway light on, even swapping out the bulb for a fresh one just to be sure. But no matter what I did, it didn't feel like enough. By the time I climbed into bed, I was too wired to sleep. My mind raced, replaying the events of the day, the humming, the handprints, the rewritten rules. Sometime around midnight, I finally started to drift off. But just as I began to relax, I heard it, dragging footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Each step was punctuated by a faint scraping sound, like something heavy was being dragged through the dirt. I lay in bed, paralyzed, my breath shallow as I strained to follow the sound. It started near the porch, then moved to the side of the cabin, then closer, much closer, to my bedroom window. I thought about pulling the curtain back to see what was out there, but something deep inside me told me not to look. Then the footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, soft at first, I heard it. Tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands gripping the blanket so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, slow and deliberate. When it finally stopped, I didn't dare move until the first faint light of dawn crept through the edges of my curtains. The next morning, I found them again. Handprints. This time they covered the windows, dozens of them, overlapping and smudged. Some were small, childlike, while others were so large they looked almost inhuman. And like before, they were all on the inside of the glass. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Beck. He picked up after the first ring. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I followed your rules, but it's getting worse. The humming, the windows, the handprints. What's happening to me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he said calmly and without an ounce of concern, "Did you forget anything?" "No," I snapped. "I triple-checked everything. The hallway light, the windows, all of it." Another pause. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he said, "The cabin doesn't like mistakes." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. "What's happening here? What is this thing?" His tone shifted, colder now. "The cabin isn't yours. You're a guest, and it doesn't like guests breaking its rules." "Whose cabin is it then?" I demanded. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, and then the line went dead. The rest of the day passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. I felt like the walls were closing in, like the cabin was alive and watching my every move. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just about the rules. The cabin wanted something, and I wasn't sure I could stop it from taking it. I had to leave. The cabin wasn't just creepy anymore. It felt wrong, like it was actively trying to keep me there. The rules, the noises, the handprints, they weren't just weird. They were warnings, and I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. I packed my things in a hurry, throwing clothes into my bag without even folding them. My phone and wallet went into my jacket pocket, and the crumpled list of rules, now scribbled with that chilling new warning, "Do not try to leave," was shoved into my bag. I wasn't playing along anymore. This cabin could keep its damn rules. The forest felt different as I walked to my car. The air was colder, the trees darker. The oppressive silence I'd noticed when I first arrived was gone, replaced with a low, constant hum that I could feel vibrating in my chest. I tried not to look back at the cabin as I threw my bag into the car and climbed into the driver's seat. The moment I turned the key, though, my stomach dropped. Nothing. The engine sputtered weakly, then died. I tried again, harder this time, pumping the gas pedal like it would make a difference, but the car refused to start. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as a sinking realization crept in. Of course it wouldn't start. This place wasn't going to let me leave. I grabbed my phone, desperate for a lifeline, but the screen showed no service, not even a single bar. I held it up, moving it around like an idiot, but it didn't matter. I let out a shaky breath, leaning back in the seat. My eyes drifted toward the trees, where the shadows seemed unnaturally deep. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. Bare, muddy footprints circled the car, leading from the forest toward the cabin. They hadn't been there when I came out. I decided to stay in the car. I locked the doors and tried to convince myself that it was safer than going back inside. I reclined the seat, pulled my jacket around me for warmth, and told myself to just wait it out until morning. Whatever was out there couldn't hurt me as long as I stayed in the car, or at least that's what I hoped. I must have drifted off at some point, because I woke to the sound of something tapping on the window. It was soft at first, just a faint click, 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 like a branch brushing against the glass. I sat up, my pulse already racing, and glanced around the car. The windows were fogged from my breath, but the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. Then it moved, from the driver's side to the back window, then the passenger side. Click, click, click. I fumbled for my flashlight, shining it toward the sound, but the beam caught nothing. Just empty forest and swirling mist. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low scratching sound. Nails or claws dragging slowly across the glass. My breath hitched as the scratching circled the car, moving from one window to the next. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something there, but all I saw was my own pale, terrified face staring back at me. Then, the door handle moved. I froze, watching as the handle on the driver's side jiggled once, then twice, as if someone or something was testing it. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. When the tapping returned, this time on the windshield, I screamed. I turned toward the sound and saw it. A face, pale and distorted, its features stretched unnaturally, like a reflection in warped glass. Its mouth twisted into a wide, toothy grin, and its hollow black eyes stared straight at me. I threw the door open and bolted, not caring where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I ran straight back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. For a brief moment, I felt safer. Then I turned around. The cabin wasn't the same. The furniture was wrong, completely out of place. The dining table was overturned, the chairs scattered across the floor. The couch had been pushed into a corner, and the rocking chair now faced the middle of the room instead of the window. The mirrors were all covered, every single one. The sheets looked old and yellowed, like they'd been pulled from some forgotten storage space, and dark stains rimmed the edges. Even the small mirror in the hallway was draped. Then I saw the list of rules. It was lying in the middle of the floor, glowing faintly. I hesitated before picking it up, my hands trembling. The words, once neat and legible, were now a chaotic scrawl. New phrases had appeared, written in that same angry red ink. You broke the rules. You can't leave now. As I stared at the page, the air in the cabin grew heavier, colder. A low rumble echoed through the room, and the walls creaked like they were shifting. Then came the whispers. They started soft, barely audible, but quickly grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of voices. You broke it. You shouldn't be here. Why didn't you follow the rules? I backed into the corner of the room, clutching the list like it would somehow protect me. The whispers swirled around me, punctuated by the sound of the rocking chair creaking violently back and forth. Desperate, I ran to the nearest window and threw it open, shouting into the night, "Help! Somebody! Please help me!" The moment the words left my mouth, the whispers stopped. Dead silence filled the cabin, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe someone had heard me. Then the room exploded into chaos. The hallway light began to flicker violently, casting jagged shadows that darted across the walls. The doors slammed open and shut, over and over, the force shaking the entire cabin. The furniture groaned as it dragged itself across the floor, and the rocking chair moved faster, creaking so loudly it drowned out every other sound. And then I heard it again, the humming. It was coming from everywhere, above me, behind me, inside me. It twisted and warped, no longer a melody, but a dissonant, guttural noise that made my skin crawl. The cabin's temperature plummeted, my breath coming out in thick white clouds. I backed away from the window, only to feel something cold brush against my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there, or at least nothing I could see. The whispers returned, louder now, screaming in a language I didn't understand. Shadows poured through the open window, slithering across the walls like living smoke. They swirled around me, closing in, their shapes shifting and morphing into figures with too many limbs, too many eyes. I ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. My hands clawed at the handle, but the harder I pulled, the louder the whispers grew. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the list of rules lying on the floor, glowing brighter now, the red ink pulsing like a heartbeat. And at the top, written in bold, jagged letters, "You should have followed the rules." I couldn't take it anymore. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was alive. It wanted something from me, and it wasn't going to stop until it had it. I knew running wasn't an option. My car wouldn't start, and the woods felt like they were closing in. I had only one choice left: confront it. My eyes drifted to the attic hatch. The noises, the humming, everything had started there. My instincts screamed to leave it alone, but I couldn't. Whatever was happening, the answers were up there. I grabbed the flashlight, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. The pull cord for the attic hatch dangled in the hallway, swaying slightly as if it had been waiting for me. I pulled it down, and the hatch creaked open, releasing a cloud of damp, icy air. The ladder unfolded with a groan, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring into the dark void above me. "Just go," I muttered under my breath, steeling myself. I climbed the ladder slowly, each step sending a loud creak through the silent cabin. The attic was freezing, the air thick and musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing piles of broken furniture, cobwebs, and dusty crates. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, surrounded by a circle of melted candles, was a journal. Its cover was cracked and rotted, the leather so worn it looked like it might crumble if I touched it. But something about it felt wrong, alive almost, like it was pulsing with its own faint energy. I stepped closer, the floor groaning under my weight, and picked it up. The moment I touched it, the air grew colder, and I felt a faint vibration run up my arm. My hands trembled as I opened it, flipping through the brittle, yellowed pages. The first entry hit me like a punch to the gut. The cabin feeds on broken rules. The rules aren't for protection, they're the terms of survival. The journal belonged to someone who had stayed in the cabin long before me. The entries were fragmented, scrawled in frantic handwriting, detailing the same strange rules and horrifying experiences I was going through. The entity is bound to the cabin. It sleeps as long as the rules are followed. If you break a rule, it wakes up. If you break enough, it feeds. Toward the end, the handwriting became almost unreadable, the words trembling and uneven. I broke too many. I hear it now. It's coming for me. If you're reading this, follow the rules. It's the only way. The final line stopped me cold. Do not trust the cabin. Do not trust yourself. The attic groaned as a gust of icy wind swept through it. My flashlight flickered and the humming started again. Soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I slammed the journal shut and spun around, my flashlight darting across the attic. Nothing. But the sound was getting closer, vibrating through the walls, through the floorboards beneath my feet. I scrambled down the ladder, clutching the journal tightly. As I reached the bottom, the hatch slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. Back in the living room, I flipped through the journal again, searching for anything that could help. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pages steady. Then I found it, a passage buried in the middle, scrawled in large, uneven letters. Follow every rule. If you survive the night, it will go dormant again. I read the words over and over, my brain struggling to process them. If the rules were the only way to weaken it, then I had to correct every mistake I'd made. The hallway light, the rocking chair, the windows. The cabin groaned, the walls trembling as if they were alive. The whispers started again, louder and more insistent this time, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. You broke the rules. You woke it up. It's coming for you. The journal slipped from my hands as I backed into the corner, my flashlight flickering wildly. And then I saw it. A shadow moved at the end of the hallway, too tall and too thin to be human. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head cocked to one side as it stepped into the light. Its face was impossible. A pale, twisted mask stretched into an unholy grin, hollow black eyes boring into me. It let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through my chest, and began to move toward me. Panic overtook me, but the journal's words rang in my head. Follow every rule. I bolted into the hallway and grabbed the spare bulb from my bag. The hallway light had burned out earlier, and I knew I had to fix it. My hands trembled as I unscrewed the old bulb, the shadow creeping closer with every passing second. The moment the new bulb clicked into place and the light flickered on, the shadow reeled back, letting out a shrill, inhuman screech. Its form twisted and warped, retreating into the darker corners of the cabin. The rules were working. I moved through the cabin like a whirlwind, fixing every mistake I could remember. I locked every window, even though the glass now felt unnaturally cold under my fingertips. Each time I latched one shut, the cabin shook, and the whispers grew angrier. I turned the rocking chair back to face the window, ignoring the way it resisted, the wood groaning under my hands like it was alive. The entity wasn't done with me. As I worked, it lashed out, slamming doors and shattering picture frames. The whispers turned to screams, and the temperature plummeted until I could see my breath hanging in the air. At 3:33 a.m., the humming started again. This time, it wasn't soft or melodic. It was a deafening, guttural roar that shook the walls of the cabin. The light in the hallway flickered violently, casting jagged shadows that seemed to reach for me. I threw myself onto the bed, clutching the journal like it was a lifeline. The doorknob rattled, the door itself bulging inward as if something massive was trying to break through. But I didn't move. I stayed in bed, repeating the rules in my head over and over, my voice trembling as I whispered them like a prayer. The hours dragged on, every second feeling like an eternity. The entity's growls echoed through the cabin, its footsteps pacing just outside my door. But then, as the first faint light of dawn crept through the windows, the noises stopped. The air grew still, the oppressive weight that had pressed down on me for days finally lifting. I stayed frozen in bed, afraid to move, until the sun fully rose, bathing the cabin in pale golden light. When I finally stepped into the living room, the cabin was eerily quiet. The furniture was back in its original place, the mirrors uncovered, the rules lying neatly on the table as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my bag, shoved the journal inside, and ran to the car. This time, the engine roared to life on the first try. As I drove down the dirt path, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there, quiet and unassuming, the morning sun glinting off its windows. But I knew the truth. It was waiting, watching, waiting for the next guest, someone who wouldn't follow the rules. Resolution and unsettling ending. By the time I reached my car, the first light of dawn was creeping through the trees, painting the cabin in an almost peaceful glow. I didn't feel peace, though. I felt like I was being watched. The engine started on the first try, but I didn't feel relief, not yet. The dirt road stretched ahead, twisting through the woods like it would never end. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something. But all I saw was the cabin, shrinking into the distance, or so I thought. Just as I reached the edge of the forest, I slammed on the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road was Mr. Beck, leaning against the hood of his truck, his arms crossed like he'd been waiting for me. I rolled down the window, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands hurt. "What the hell was that?" I demanded. My voice cracked, still raw from screaming all night. He didn't answer right away. He just studied me, his face calm, almost amused. "Well," he said finally, "did you enjoy your stay?" "Enjoy my stay?" I shouted, my chest tightening. "Are you kidding me? That thing, it almost killed me. I followed your rules, and it still came after me. What is wrong with that cabin?" His expression didn't change. "Did you follow all the rules?" "Yes," I snapped. I tried. I missed one or two, but..." "There you go," he interrupted, shrugging. "What are you talking about?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I almost died because of your damn rules." "You should have read the fine print," he said, his tone as casual as if we were discussing a parking ticket. "What fine print?" I snapped, leaning out the window. He sighed, his face softening into something almost pitying. "The cabin doesn't care if you try," he said. "It only cares if you get it right." I stared at him, my heart pounding. What does that even mean? He straightened, brushing off his jacket. "The cabin doesn't take what it doesn't want. Consider yourself lucky. Most people don't get to leave." "Most people," I whispered. He nodded, climbing into his truck. "It's not personal," he said before shutting the door. "Just the rules." And with that, he drove off, his truck disappearing into the woods like it had never been there. When I got back to my apartment, everything felt wrong. It wasn't the apartment itself, it was me. I had escaped the cabin, but something about it had followed me. I felt it in the air, in the shadows that stretched a little too long, in the silence that was just a little too quiet. I told myself it was all in my head, stress, exhaustion, paranoia. I threw my bag on the couch and collapsed into bed, not even bothering to unpack. The first night, I slept deeply, too deeply. When I woke the next morning, there was a piece of paper on the kitchen counter. At first, I thought it was a receipt or a note I'd left myself and forgotten, but when I picked it up, My blood ran cold. It was a list. Do not leave the bathroom light on overnight. Keep all closet doors closed at all times. If you hear knocking after 2 a.m., do not respond. The handwriting was identical to the list from the cabin. I crumpled it in my hand and threw it in the trash. But when I turned back around, the paper was back on the counter, perfectly smooth and unwrinkled. The rules weren't the only thing that came back with me. That night, I heard the knocking again. It started faint, like someone tapping gently on the walls. I stayed in bed, clutching the covers, trying to convince myself it was a neighbor or a pipe. But then the knocking moved to the closet door. I didn't open it. The next morning, I found the door slightly ajar, even though I knew I had locked it. The rules kept coming. Each day, a new piece of paper would appear on the counter with more instructions. Some of them made sense. Don't leave the lights on. Don't open doors after dark. Others didn't. Place a bowl of water under your bed every night. Do not speak your name aloud after sunset. If you see your reflection move, do not react. The rules weren't just here to protect me. They were here to trap me, to make sure I didn't forget where I'd been. A week later, I came home from work to find a package on my doorstep. There was no return address, just my name written in the same sharp, slanted handwriting. My hands trembled as I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, in bold red letters, was the heading, "New Rules." The list was longer this time, with instructions even more bizarre and cryptic. But what stopped me wasn't the rules. It was the signature at the bottom. It wasn't signed by a person. It was signed with the cabin's address. I've tried to tell myself I'm imagining things, that none of this is real. But deep down, I know the truth. The cabin didn't let me go. It just changed the rules.